Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. Today's video is part one of 5 lectures on Plato's Republic. So today we'll do an introduction to the basic structure and themes of the work before we get started on books 1 to 10 of the Republic in separate videos. So let's get started. So a little bit of background. Obviously, Plato is the most influential thinker in the Western tradition, and as Whitehead famously said, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Incredibly important thinker, and the Republic is perhaps his greatest and most influential work. Plato's work's rich in terms of both the literary dimensions of the work as well as the philosophical profundity. And I want to emphasize both. Often, the Republic or any of Plato's dialogues is merely mined as if it were a philosophical treatise. We'll take a different approach. We're going to be very attentive to the literary dimensions. And on that general approach of trying to see both the literary and philosophical dimensions, I invite you to look at my video on how to read a Platonic dialogue. I'll have a link in the description. It's a work, The Republic, I've read countless times, and each time I find different nuggets in every sentence. The richness, the complexity of the work is just incredible. It's undoubtedly one of the greatest works ever written. And I think Nietzsche sums it up really well in his short essay early on in his career. It's called The Greek State, and he refers there to Plato's esoteric doctrine. And full quotes worth quoting here. In the concept of the Platonic state, the wonderfully grand hieroglyph of a profound esoteric doctrine of the connection between state and genius, eternally needing to be interpreted. And I think that's so true and in so many ways, how he's underscored that there's an esoteric doctrine there, that it eternally needs to be interpreted because of that rich complexity, and how it points to this connection between the state and the genius or the individual. The As in Strauss's terms, the city and man is this fundamental polarity and tension at work in the work as a whole. So if you're interested in Nietzsche, I have a video on an introduction to Nietzsche's works and thinking. So I'll put a link in the description there. I'll also put a link to, I have an academic work that's a close analysis of Nietzsche's The Greek State, and showing how the whole essay is an explication of Plato's Republic. So the standard interpretation of the Republic, basically, I would say 99% of the interpreters out there will approach it as Plato's blueprint for a perfect society, how to administer in a rational way a just society. So according to that point of departure, it lays out the rational ordering of a society, and this ordering is seen as possible through philosophic rule, and that this philosophic rule would be natural and just. And this would be seen as something that Plato would advocate for. And this utopian system then becomes criticized, for instance, by someone such as Karl Popper in his Open Society and Its Enemies. The first volume is about that. That spell of Plato is the subtitle. And he goes into the Republic as one of these foundational works early on that is an enemy of the Open Society. It's a utopian or dystopian system for totalitarian control. And the assumption there is Popper and others are taking Plato's, what we call his exoteric doctrine, at face value. If we pay heed to Plato's mode of writing and his ultimate esoteric doctrine, we can see that he is pointing to the fact that philosophy and political rule tend in opposite directions. So rather than positing some sort of rational ordering of society with philosophic rule as what he's advocating for, he's subtly pointing to the fact that philosophy and political rule tend in opposite directions. And if we were to oversimplify and remembering the context of the quarrel of philosophy and poetry, and I'll link another video there that I have on the quarrel of philosophy and poetry. If we're to oversimplify, we could say that Plato's mission is basically to have an exoteric shell that tries to assuage society that, don't worry, philosophers teach justice, teach the virtues that are amenable to political society, and are that philosophers are beneficial to the city and would be the best rulers if society would only listen. So that's what the exoteric doctrine would be, the let's say the salutary lie that would benefit society. And then underneath, the esoteric doctrine would be philosophers' notion of justice actually transcends the narrow dimensions of the political, and philosophers don't want to rule. The highest life that and the one that philosophers seek is one of detachment from the political things outside the cave. So let's begin with an overview of the Republic and an overview of how to approach it. And I would say, much like reading a play by Shakespeare, in reading a Platonic dialogue, we have to pay attention to three directions at once. We have to pay attention to what is said, the speeches, the arguments, the thoughts of the characters, and in Greek that's logos. What is done, the dramatic action of the dialogue, so that in Greek that's ergon, and what is presented by poetic mythic images and parallels, so the mythos, the story. And I want to highlight, you can see on the right, the cover of a great work, maybe the best all-around work on Plato that I've come across, being in Logos, reading the Platonic Dialogues by John Sallis, who is the one that I would cite here for developing this threefold schema for interpreting the dialogues. So if you take that approach, you can take the dialogue, which I've tried to do here, and you can download this document in the description. I won't go through all of this, but in the document, as you'll see, for each of the books, you can break down what was said in that book. You can take a few high-level notes of some key points of action in the dialogue. One character's interrupting another, the setting. For instance, in book one, we have, when it comes to the argument, we have a discussion on the nature of justice among Socrates and three characters, Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. In terms of the action, Socrates is on his way out of the Piraeus, which is this port in Athens, but he's held back to return to the house of Polemarchus, where this discussion takes place. And in terms of, let's say, the archetypal images, the mythos, we have a repetition of this mythical descent to the underworld. He had descended into the Piraeus and was trying to ascend, but was held back. So I won't go through in all detail all of this in the work, but as I said, I invite you to download this and you can refer to it yourself. You can see that the same structure is at play and can be highlighted in the other books as well. So when approaching any work, it's good to try to think about what is the overall whole or unity of the work. And this is something right in accordance with Plato's own point of departure in the Phaedrus. So in the Phaedrus, he critiques writing, but he also holds out, Socrates does, the possibility of a beautiful mode of writing, he calls it, wherein every part of the discourse has its proper place and performs its appropriate function within the organic unity of the whole. And we can assume that Plato attempted to properly design his works in this way. So what would be the, let's say, the unity, the organizing structure of the whole within the Republic? I think the image of the descent into the underworld provides a unifying structure for the work. So the first words of the Republic are, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess. So Katabine, I went down in Greek. This echoes and calls to memory the lines from Odysseus, from the Odyssey, where Odysseus recounts to Penelope that he went down to Hades to inquire about the return of myself and my friends. It's book 23. And we see this theme of this descent to the underworld at play throughout key junctures of the work as a whole. So in the beginning, the descent to the Piraeus that I just mentioned, I went down yesterday. And this descent could be seen as a descent indeed in terms of the action of Socrates. In the middle, Socrates describes the very famous, very poignant image of the cave, and in that, the human condition is likened to that of souls in the underworld. So we have a descent to the underworld in speech. And then at the end, Socrates describes this myth of where this character was allowed to descend into Hades, to journey through the underworld and return to the world above. So we have a descent to the underworld in terms of myth or story. And with that in mind, we can think with that as a type of unifying principle, we can look at the structure of the Republic as a whole. So we begin with the narration of this descent to the Piraeus that Socrates had undertaken the day before, how he talked about justice with a couple of characters. That developed into a discussion through books 2 to 4 of where we could find perfect justice in the individual and in a city. So through that discussion, they end up constructing what, according to the interlocutors, would be a just city. And the just city has a certain number of features. It has this ordering of the classes, the rulers, the guardians, and the laborers or money makers. And this accords with the structure of the soul of the individual, we find out. Then from books 5 to 7, which is represented here in this middle peak of the pyramidal structure, there's a discussion of this of let's say the philosophic city, which transcends that political city. It's prompted by a discussion of why philosophers would be the best suited to rule this city that's been constructed in speech. The other characters can't really believe that they would be useful in this, so Socrates has to, let's say, defend the way of philosophy, and he uses the similes of the sun, the line, and the cave, which form the real center of the work as a whole, to do so. And then, having described, let's say, the construction of the good city, having a digression of sorts at the center on the way of the philosopher, Socrates then describes how cities decay, how the city, even the good city as described, would decay from aristocracy to timocracy to oligarchy to democracy and then to tyranny. So that's books 8 to 9 represented here. And then in book 10, we have a critique of poetry at the beginning of that, building on the critique of poetry that had been presented earlier in books 2 to 3, as well as this description of the myth of involving another descent into the underworld that I just described. So here we see this overall structure mirroring the theme of a descent and ascent that we said provides the unity to the work as a whole. Now, Plato's work has been immensely influential throughout the history of the Western tradition. And to take just 2 examples, in Thomas More's Utopia and in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, we can see in each of their works, there's a conscious effort, I think, to reverse or play with that structure that's presented in the Republic. And I have videos that I'll link on each of those that describe the structure of Thomas More's Utopia and how it's a reversal of the Republic. Similarly, a video on the structure of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and how it's a reversal of Plato's Republic. On the title, so the regime, so the title in English is generally translated as republic. It's politeia in Greek. It's the essential constitution and ordering of the community. The better translation would be regime. We can see that in the translation that I recommend people use by Alan Bloom. He makes this point in one of his notes, but he hasn't changed the translation of the title just because of the weight of the English tradition of translation. He respects that tradition and says, okay, well, most people know this work as the Republic, so let's continue with that. But let's think of Republic as regime in Greek. And the course of the dialogue as a whole, this sense of the word comes to be expanded to the type of regime or politeia one can imagine forming in oneself. And there's a tension between these two regimes or two cities, between the order of the individual and the order of the many. And that's kind of one of the central paradoxes of the work as a whole. On the regime, Aristotle comes along a little bit later and ends up defining this a bit more clearly for us. He says in the Politics, the regime is an arrangement of a city with respect to its offices, particularly the one that has authority over all matters. For what has authority in the city is everywhere the governing body, and the governing body is the regime. So the regime is that form that shapes and gives character to the individual members of the community. And he uses an example in the Politics of a chorus. So a chorus in a drama can be a tragic chorus or a comic chorus. So it's the same individuals playing those roles as in the chorus, but even though it's the same individual human members, the form of the drama gives them the shape, gives them the character as tragic or comic. So the form as a whole gives that identity to the particulars. So in modern representative government, we feel that government should reflect the values or opinions of those they rule, that government should take its character from society out of which it arises, that the whole should be defined by the parts. But in the classical understanding of the polis, the regime has a formative character and is itself the primary factor in shaping or giving character to the community it rules. So it's why it's such a fundamental question for Plato, I think, and would later be for Aristotle, is how this regime ends up shaping character and how it becomes the condition of possibility for certain types of ways of life or certain types of human flourishing. Different types of individuals are going to flourish in the Republican, civically minded regime of Rome than the regime of modern liberal republicanism, where it's the pursuit of individual desires, individual wealth, individual happiness. Another way of forming this in one's mind here, I think, is Aristotle's distinction or discussion of the relation of part and whole, and he carries that over from the metaphysics, but also to the politics. So we often say, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and Aristotle is the one who prompts us into that thinking. In the case of all things which have several parts and in which the totality is not, as it were, a mere heap, but the whole is something besides the parts. So the whole is more than the sum of the parts, unless it's just a heap. So if we have a pile of sand, that's just a heap of sand. But if we have a sand castle, then every grain of sand belongs in a particular place. And because of that form, the sand castle form, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. The whole of that sand castle is more than just a sum of the individual grains of sand. So too with the community. The city is the same type of compound entity, a whole that is made up of parts. And the identity of the city derives obviously from those who are acknowledged to be its citizens. But what qualifies a person for citizenship is that a citizen is one who takes part in the decision making. So it is a part that participates in the whole. And citizenship is a function of the regime. So we get back to the form. It is the form of the whole that impresses that character on that whole. For example, oligarchy will have a different set of individuals as decision-making citizens than monarchy or democracy. So I'm going to end there. That's our introductory comments on the structure of the republic. We talked about the title as well in terms of the regime and what we need to think about of the Greek thinking of the regime as opposed to our own thinking of a state, that type of nomenclature. In the next video, we'll start with a detailed look at Book One of the Republic. So I'll see you next time.